I didn't believe in monsters until I came face to face with one. It was early summer and I had just returned to northern Wisconsin to visit my grandparents who live deep in the countryside. Their house sits on the edge of a vast forest with a creek that runs through the backyard, and I'd spent many childhood summers there exploring the woods. But this visit would be different, something I never imagined would happen in a place that once felt so familiar and safe. One evening, just after sunset, I decided to go for a walk down the old trail that winds from my grandparents' house down to the creek. The sky was streaked with that last fading light, and the warm breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. The woods were alive with the sound of crickets and occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I felt a sense of nostalgia as I walked, and the memories of simpler days washing over me. I reached the clearing by the creek where the water gurgled gently over the rocks, and I sat on a fallen log. The evening felt calm, peaceful, until I realized how quickly that sense of serenity had faded. The usual forest sounds were gone. The crickets had stopped chirping, and the air seemed heavy and still, as if the woods were holding their breath. A sudden rustling came from across the creek, loud and deliberate. I stood up, trying to peer through the gathering darkness. At first I thought it might be a deer, but the way the branches cracked under the weight of whatever was moving told me this was no deer. Then I saw it. A hulking shape slowly emerging from the shadows, stepping into the moonlight. My breath caught in my throat. It was massive, with a body that looked almost like a bodybuilder, broad shoulders, long limbs, and fur so dark it seemed to absorb the light. It walked on two legs like a man, but its head was that of a wolf. A long, snarling snout, pointed ears, and eyes that burned in a vivid, unnatural yellow. I froze, my legs rooted to the ground as if they belonged to someone else. The creature lowered itself slightly as if it was preparing to pounce, and I could see its claws glinting in the dim light. My heart raced so loud I wondered if this creature could hear it. It didn't attack, though. It just stared at me, its chest rising and falling with deep, rumbling breaths. I kept thinking maybe this was some sort of man that was dressed up, but the terror I felt only pointed to something so much worse. A part of me was transfixed by its eyes, the way they seemed to look through me rather than at me, as if it were trying to understand what I was. Slowly, it raised its head and sniffed the air. That motion seemed to break the spell. I stumbled back, nearly losing my balance. The creature's ears flickered at the noise, and in that moment, its snarl deepened into a sound that made my bones feel like ice. I turned and ran, the way back to my grandparents' house, feeling longer than it ever had. I ran and ran and ran. I could hear heavy footfalls behind me just for a few moments, and then nothing. Silence again. When I burst through the back door, gasping for breath, my grandparents looked up at me in alarm. I told them everything, the words spilling out of me in a rush. My grandfather didn't say a word. He just looked up, grabbed his old rifle, and locked every door and window. He wouldn't talk about it. He wouldn't even make eye contact with me. He seemed so unsettled. He didn't want to talk about it afterward, only muttering something about there are things you don't want to disturb in these woods. I've thought about that night countless times, about those burning yellow eyes, the intelligence behind them. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't just an animal. It wasn't a person. It felt ancient, powerful, and above all, too real.